For thousands of years, only indigenous communities traversed Florida's dense interior. The Kissimmee River Valley was an area of lakes, floodplains, and oak hammocks inaccessible to most until the late 19th century. At that time, Floridians began to populate this area, developing navigable waterways and unique communities. Camp Mack, located along the Kissimmee River on the eastern end of Polk County, has been a hub for gamesmen and adventurers since the 1830s. The following interviews will introduce community members connected to the Kissimmee River Valley and Camp Mack. The first ranchers of European descent moved into Polk County in 1848. The Kissimmee River Valley provided good quality grazing areas for cattle. Early pioneers, such as Jacob Summerlin, came to manage enormous herds throughout the region. Until 1949, cattle were kept on open ranges, so cattlemen, also known as cow hunters, would travel for weeks at a time herding animals. Many of the pioneering cattle ranching families remained present in Central Florida for generations, intermingling and becoming known as Florida Crackers.
My name is Dwight King. Sam King was my father, and I am kin to, they were 5 King boys, 6 at one time. One got killed at where the fire tower is at Indian Lake Estates on 630 back in the 20s. And they were 5 brothers, and they were all in the cattle business here. Kings came to Florida between 1840 and 45. And Manatee County, western Polk County, and they moved. My grandfather moved over here in 1904. My daddy was 5 years old, and moved to where Fort Arbuckle is in the bombing range today. And then a few years later, they moved up north of there to the Dallas Sullivan homestead, and they started in the cattle business around 1918, and went on. They ended up buying some land and here and there. Paul King, Barney King, Allison King, Roy King, uncles. Been here a pretty good while. They owned a little citrus, not a whole lot. All together, probably 300 acres, maybe something like that. Uncle Barney's outfit still owns, I think, 2,500 acres or something like that on Camp Mack Road, west side of Camp Mack Road. Uncle Roy's outfit, R.J. King, I think they own 50 acres or something where that place was. And those guys were old. And a cow rancher back in those days, you fed your family and made a living to have a cow, but when payday came, you sold the land, you know. That's how you got that's the way that thing usually worked. Very few people keep it generational. It'll always bust up somewhere down the line, regardless of how big you are, you know. Usually, not all cases, but usually. Uncle Roy sold the Armington family some land. Uncle Barney sold, what's that place, Money Tree?
Money Tree Ranch.
Yeah, some of that sold. They've sold some to the Nature Conservancy. But, you know, it's all, my dad owned Indian Lake Estates one time, sold that. They owned about 60,000 acres, the 5 brothers, at one time. But like I say, my dad was born in 1899. Time, you know, I got up grown. He was an old man, so, you know, time to quit. Cattle, that's all, you know, we did, cows. I had to grow later on, but I hated orange grove. Working cattle was different. There's always some excitement, somebody getting bucked off or half killed or something, you know. It was a pretty good deal. Went cow hunting. I'd ride from where I live on Sam King Road to the fore end of the Indian Lake Estates. What's now, we called it Rock Branch, but I've been home 9 o'clock at night, 5 years old, riding a horse all day, starved to death, nothing, no water to drink, wanting mama. But you overed it, didn't hurt you. Fort Gardner is it's probably 3/4 of a mile right there to where Fort Gardner was. I knew a guy named Tom Brown. Frostproof was a history buff, and he had the longitude and latitude of where those forts were. And I've been there a million times, you know. I was married to Bill Zipper's daughter, William, 9 years, 364 days, and I spent quite a bit of time there over the years. I got a lot of memories, working cattle over there with them, and we were neighbors. Tiger Creek was the boundary between our land and the Zipper estate. Mary Ann Drasdo's, I guess, great-grandfather, Aaron Gideon Zipper, was raised by the Jacob Summerlin, the big cow man in Florida. And I think that man was, I don't even know if he was a teenager when Mr. Summerlin took him in. He was quite a character. And he came here and bought some of that land. Probably Summerlin would have had cattle here at that time. The Zipper Estate brand is a Summerlin brand. His son, W.C. Zipper Sr., who's the father, William, Harry, Pinky, Evelyn, Mary, all of them. He died in 1947, and then they bought what they call Buster Island, I think 48 maybe, something like that. Buster Island, there was a slough there from Rosalie Lake to Kissimmee Lake. In the late 40s, they dug that out and made a canal that dropped. Rosalie Lake's higher than Kissimmee Lake, and it dropped it down. And then when Zipper Estate sold the land to the park, they filled that ditch back in, parts of it. And there's a boat marina there, and you go out there and I guess Tiger Cove, right at the mouth of Tiger Creek. About changed, there was a bridge over Tiger Creek at one time. My family leased Buster Island, had the cattle before the Zippers owned it. I think I'm not 100% sure, but I think Ray Snell, Winter Havens guy that owned it, and Zip, Zip, they called him Zip a lot, bought it probably in 48 when he took over the estate. There was a bridge there, and there was a man in Lake Wales named Galen Martin, had an old Model T, and he'd been up here. He was going back, he was staying at the old cabin at Zippers, and he's going back home, and he go down across that bridge. Well, Uncle Paul, one of my uncles, he used to work, anybody that hunted or fished or anything like that, he called them sportsmen, and he hated sportsmen. Well, they'd go there and burn that bridge out. And old Galen drove his Model T off that thing. He sunk right there, and he walked to where I live. They went up there and got it out some way, and he sold it to a man in Lake Wales, and they hooked it to a pump motor and pumped orange grove out of a lake up in town for the next 50 years or something, you know. It was different back then. I lived a good life growing up where I did. It was 7 miles by road, my nearest neighbor. Ride a horse and just shoot your gun, life was good. But all the progress, as they call it. Captain Clay Johnson had the steamboats, and I got a picture of one of the anchors. Mary Ann Drasdo has the anchor. They had Red, her daddy was Harry Kenneth the Zipper, and they called him Red. He had the anchor off the Rosalie and the Lily. And of course she'll keep it, she won't ever get rid of it, but a lot of history. Steamboat, Captain Clay Johnson. I had a check written on the Skipper Mercantile Store in 1913. My grandpa wrote to Captain Clay Johnson about some buying supplies and whatever off the steamboat. Cause you had to get it off the steamboat or drive to mule and wagon, ox cart, go to Fort Meade, Bartow, or Tampa if you wanted something. Oh, little old boy broke in my house one time and stole that, had it in a little box, and he stole my checks. Written with a pencil. Daddy would go there. He got his first ice water off the steamboat. Had a wood keg, had some ice in it. First ice water. You know, I guess he drank cold water out of a pitcher pump, but actual ice water with ice in it. First time he ever did that. There wasn't much going on here when he came. They bought somewhere later on there, a man got a car and they bought a 5-gallon can of gas. Johnson ran his boat from Kissimmee to Okeechobee and back, you know. And he went down there one time. He was about 10 years old, something. Him and Grandpa, and there was a house cat, had some kittens, and he picked one of those kittens up and brought him home, stole him. And Grandma told him he couldn't have that cat, so he walked all the way back through the woods, Great Pine, about 3 miles, and took that cat back. Then later on he said, I should have knocked that cat in the head. Still have to walk all the way down there, but he took him back to his mom. Philadelphia dock was the dock that Clay Johnson stopped at, was in our pasture. And I remember the dock, all the posts were there, the building was gone when I was, young, but those posts stayed there till way up in the 60s. There was a man named Willingham, was a bad man from Polk County, killed 3 people. 2 of them, he performed a public service, but one of them they didn't like about him. He killed his brother-in-law. And they got him drunk there at that dock, and they hog-tied him and took him away from the state for about 10 years. He was a famous guy, him and his father, about early Polk County. Blue Jordan, where on 630, you heard the word Kissimmee Island. It's formed by rivers and lakes and sloughs and stuff. Blue Jordan is one of those boundaries. He cut a right-of-way through there in the 1840s. Bill Willingham's father. They're both buried in Fort Meade. Everybody went to Camp Mack with Jackie and Ron, and I were school friends, and I came over here a lot, but a lot of good memories. Came over here and ate, and fish fries. Weber College women, we had a good time. High school girls, life was good. I remember all the cabins, I remember the water hole. I swam in the water hole where the flooring well was. I remember all of it. Pre-ditch days, clear the crystal, they was fishing there. They had big old bass, and they had all. It was nice. It was very, very nice. I caught the school bus at my house at 5 minutes to 6. We'd drive to Kissimmee River from my house and pick up the kids at the river, and some from Max's Ranch and some from Buck Mann's place. And then we'd start picking up, go to Shady Oaks and pick up the Albritons and, pick up back to town. They'd let us smoke on the bus until we got to about the honey house, and they'd make us quit smoking. Then, of course, I got, grown. My brother and I went to military school in Georgia. And I wasn't here, I came back, I graduated from Lake Wales, but my daddy and them were big men. 5 of them. Highway 60 was a dirt road. There's a place called Scrub Pens. It's just east of Vic Storage Grove there on 60. They went up there and camped. They heard Jack Dempsey was going to Miami to fight. And they camped there and they stopped every car. Asked them if you was Jack Dempsey, and the guy said nope, said you can go on. The third day, they stopped this car and said, you Jack Dempsey? Said, yeah, Jack Dempsey. He said, we heard you fight pretty good. He said, well, some people say I can. He said, we're the Keene boys, and we fight too. And he whipped all 5 of them and went on to Miami. And that's a true story because Tom McEwen wrote it in the morning after from Leon Denton, where he got the story. And I asked Daddy one time, I said, Daddy, did y'all really do that? He said, son, always remember that 99% of all stories is fiction. So we don't know if he did or didn't. The Kissimmee River Valley is one of the top 3 or 4 places in the world known for cattle grazing. The Downs, the Channel Country in Australia, the Kissimmee River, pre-ditch days, and the Pampas in Argentina. It's a fattening place for cattle and natural range, not modern fertilizer and planting grass and all that kind of stuff. But there was no trees down there, you know, like at Max's Ranch. There wasn't any trees on that thing. There's a lot of stumps there that burnt off below the ground. You look out there and you can go for miles, thousands, tens of thousands of acres. There's not a tree, not a pine tree, a pine tree. There's pine trees on the coon hammock grave, but Mr. Maxey planted them. My Uncle Paul came on Bramah Island, bought it for Consolidated Naval Stores. And I've been Bramah Island probably 4 years old, you know, I don't know, I can't remember. He sold it to Doyle Lightsey about 53, and I was there when they got the cattle off, moved his cattle off with a barge. One time my half-brother Ralph Smith moved to Australia. Him and Uncle Paul were over there one time. Had the cattle and like 4 horses on the barge, and the barge turned over, capsized, and killed all the cattle and all the horses. And my brother told me how many minutes they kicked before the last one died, trying to get out, which they couldn't do it. But I've been there 100 times. In 1953, we had a dry year, and drove a Jeep pickup from Uncle Paul's side of the lake on the mainland to Bramah Island. It's white sand you could drive, you know. And there was a man named Bill Barber and his wife from Kissimmee, had driven from Kissimmee down there in a little army Jeep. So, you know, the lake has gone down, up, down, up, down. I've been at Kissimmee River, just in the ditch from Hatchney Hall to Kissimmee Lake was dug a long time ago. Then they came back, you know, the Hamilton Distant days. Well, the New Deal in the 60s, they dug all that out big and deep. I've crossed Kissimmee River down there out from Billy's old house. Kissimmee River's that wide and that deep, you know. You can step across it. So, you know, it gets dry, it gets wet. Then, like Ronnie said, you go in the store and it's knee deep, you know. You had that. It made a mark on the oak trees. It made a line. And it'd take years for that line to go away. You know, it sat there for months. An oak tree, supposedly, if the water's moving, it won't kill it. And of course, the water was constantly moving, but it's moving very slow. But so it would be I've seen Kissimmee Lake come up, and Tiger Lake. The road, Daddy built a road, and what Sam King Road now, he built it in 1941 to our house, and we have 2 trucks, high water time, truck on one side, and then we go to town buy groceries, you come there, and you would walk and carry the groceries to the next truck and go to the house, There's 3 of us first cousins left, Eva Mae King Bowers. She owns some land. She probably, I don't know how much she owns, but it was about 2,500 acres, 3,000. She got half, and her brother Bill got half. She's bedridden, I understand, and another girl lives in Alabama. And I'm the last male, the older, that knows the story of what went on.
In 1881, Hamilton Diston began to drain the Kissimmee River Valley for development and dredge waterways for steamboat travel. These efforts eventually connected Lake Kissimmee to Fort Myers and the Gulf through a series of waterways. Steamboats traveled along the narrow rivers, bringing needed supplies into Florida's interior, while also exporting the region's agricultural products. An increasing number of northern tourists could also be found on board these vessels. Tourists took in the scenery and hunted game. Shell Hammock Landing, located near the oxbow of the Kissimmee River in Lake Wales, was a potential destination for such tourists.
We are George and Sue McNamara. I am the great-great-grandson of George Bryan Cattleman, this young fellow here, who was the original purchaser of Shell Hammock in my family. Shell Hammock was purchased before that. He purchased it in 1901. And Sue can give you the full story of how it came to be Shell Hammock as opposed to being the Internal Improvement Fund in the 1840s and 50s.
Well, the Internal Improvement Fund was created in the 1850s, and the original buyer of Shell Hammock was Ingram Fletcher, and he came from Orlando. He was their postmaster there, and he was also in real estate, and McQuaig, who purchased Shell Hammock, was his partner. So he bought it from Ingram Fletcher, and it went through a couple of other owners before it was purchased by George Bryan Cattleman.
Yeah, it was originally named McQuaig's Landing. Before that, it didn't have a name. But when my great-great-grandfather, George Bryan Cattleman, bought the property, he ended up naming it Shell Hammock. And it's interesting how the name came about. And it came about because the whole property, 200 and some acres, is largely an oak hammock off of the river and the lakes. And a hammock, of course, is a higher, drier piece of land off of lowlands and wetlands. Well, when he bought it, he discovered that there were Indian mounds on the property, kitchen middens. And on those old kitchen middens, which are several hundred years old, the tortoises dug into holes in the ground. And when the tortoises dug down into these mounds, they kicked up pottery shards, arrowheads and old Indian tools, but mostly the staple that the Indians lived off of the time, and that was little teeny shells that came from the bottom of the lake and the rivers, as well as mussel shells. But anyway, there were shells all over the ground from where these tortoises had dug up the ground. And George Bryan Cattleman thought that was interesting and ended up naming the property Shell Hammock. Not the Ponderosa, but Shell Hammock.
Charles Franklin McQuigg. He built it circa 1881 after he purchased it and built the house. Not only was he a realtor in Orlando, he also bought a boat and was a steamboat captain, and he basically worked in Okeechobee. So what he did with his boat was he cleared the river of snags and trees and things to make it easier for the other boats to come down the river.
We believe, and our research and history books seem to back up the conclusion, that he built the house that we live in now as a hotel for people coming from Kissimmee going down to Okeechobee. We don't know if they were tourists or whether it was people that were just traveling back and forth. But on his boats, a steamboat, his main objective was to haul goods and give services to people. So some of the history books that we find indicate that Shell Hammock was built and there was a hotel on the property, and we believe that hotel is our property. And I know for a fact, because I can even remember back in the 40s when it was used as a guest house for people that were fishing and doing activities on the rivers.
Architecturally, it was significant, or is significant, because it's an old cracker style architecture, and with the porches and sitting up off the ground and the wide eaves to cool you, keep you cool when it was hot out in the summertime.
Well, the steamboats, of course, were used to transport produce mostly, but also goods of all different kinds, flowers and turpentine and lumber and whatever else up and down the river. And it was the only way to get to the central part of the river, especially down to the Okeechobee area, because it was prior to the time that the railroads and any infrastructure came in. And the steamboats were an integral part of the development of the Central Florida, this area down here around
Kissimmee River Valley.
Polk County and the whole Kissimmee River Valley. Kissimmee River Valley runs from the north side of Lake Topekalaga up at the city of Kissimmee down to the north shores of Lake Okeechobee. Now, it's also considered the upper Everglades, the headwaters of the Everglades. So when Hamilton came along in the 1880s, he started digging canals and ditches and to drain the Kissimmee River Valley, and his overall plan, his big plan, was to drain the Everglades. Of course, all of the politicians back in that time, their plans were to drain the Everglades, which would add millions and millions of acres of farmland and citrus groves and developments and whatever else. As we know now, that turned out to be one of the worst ideas that ever happened to the state of Florida. But speaking of Hamilton Diston, he's a story in himself, but he is probably the most single influential person to the development of this area, the Kissimmee River Valley area, to buy 4 million acres of property from the Internal Improvement Fund at 25 cents per acre. So he paid $1 million, which saved the Internal Improvement Fund, which was under receivership at the time through the federal courts because it was going bankrupt. The Internal Improvement Fund was originally formed as a trust to develop the lowlands and wetlands in Florida. But as a result of the Civil War and then Reconstruction after the Civil War, all the bonds and the loans that the Internal Improvement Fund made to railroads and highway companies and other stuff, they were, because of the Depression after the Civil War and the Reconstruction period, they were just about to go bankrupt. And like I say, that's when it went into receivership, and when the governor cut a deal with Hamilton Diston and brought them out of receivership with his $1 million. He almost immediately, I think he bought it in September of 1881, and then October of 1881, he sold half of those 4 million acres to a member of Parliament in England for $600,000. So he made a little profit on that, but his plan was still, and he cut a deal with the Internal Improvement Fund to drain the lowlands here, but especially around Lake Okeechobee and over toward the west coast. And the Internal Improvement Fund at the time had 15 million acres of land. And if Hamilton Diston was able, he never did complete it, of course, but if he was able to do it, he could have gained as much as 12 million acres of land himself. And by the way, that 4 million acres of land, and I'm sure this record still holds, but at the time, and up until at least a few years ago, that made him the largest single landowner in the world. Not just in Florida, not just the United States, but in the world. And I don't think that record's been broke. I still think he's the leading landholder at 4 million acres. He didn't live very long. He only lived about 10 years after he made that purchase, and he thought he was in bankruptcy. As it turned out, he was not.
Wasn't going well at all.
Some people say that he killed himself, and other people say that he died of heart failure. So nobody knows on that. Nobody will ever know. But he was very successful. He moved down to Florida, to Kissimmee from Philadelphia, set up an office there, and his first canal that he dug was between East Lake Topekalaga and West Lake Topekalaga. And East Lake, one of the story goes that when he unplugged the dam and the canal between the two of them, that he drained East Lake Toho down 56 inches in less than a month. So you can imagine the water flow that came out. East Lake is a huge lake, so that's a lot of water. But he also set up sugar cane operations and rice paddies in the St. Cloud area, and was very successful in growing sugar cane.
It was also rumored that Shell Hammock, the house there now, was used to house Hamilton Diston's workers as he was digging the canal from Lake Cypress down to Kissimmee. The C-37 is what they call it now. But we never could prove that, but it's a good story.
The steamboat industry was here long before Hamilton Diston ever showed up, but because he was digging his canals, it certainly increased the steamboat operations and gave the steamboat captains more room to run their boats and push their barges. And of course they could build bigger steamboats and better steamboats. One of the interesting stories that I always like to tell, and my mother used to always tell, was she, as a child in the early 1920s, her and her sister, when they got out of school, they would get on the steamboat in Kissimmee and come south to Shell Hammock. And her mother died when she was very young, only 2 years old, and her father lived at Shell Hammock, but her grandmother raised her in Kissimmee where she went to school. But she used to love to tell the stories about when she'd be on the steamboat and the steamboat captain would let her blow the whistle to let her dad know that they were there. And she also loved it when the steamboat would get hung up on a sandbar, and everybody on the steamboat would have to get off and
push it off the sandbar.
The steamboat off of the bars.
She said that if the Rosetta, now that's the steamboat that's mostly associated with Shell Hammock, but she said if he was pushing one barge, he could turn in the oxbow to Shell Hammock, but if he was pushing 2 barges, he couldn't, and that's when he let the girls honk the horn. She loved that story, and she said it was so much fun to get in that cool water and push that steamboat off the sandbar.
Well, there were, of course, different size steamboats, but most of them were fairly small by comparison, like 20 to 40 feet long and 10, 12, 15 feet wide with flat bottoms, very shallow draft because all the waters of the Kissimmee River, especially in the dry season, were just very shallow. And even when they dug the first canals, when Hamilton Diston dug the first canal, they were still only 2 or 3 feet deep. So they could transport lots of weight and they could transport lots of people because they had that flat bottom and didn't pull very much water. So as far as the number of people, they had some of the steamboats that ran out of Kissimmee had staterooms on them. So people could spend the night on the boat if they wanted to.
Take a long cruise down the river.
It wasn't anything elaborate like we think of now on the cruise ships, but at least it was a place where somebody had a cot they could lay down, didn't have to stand on the deck all day. Well, you got to remember those old paddle wheel steamboats only ran between 1 and 2.5 miles an hour, depending on what the wind was doing. So, although it's only 18 miles from Kissimmee to Shell Hammock, it could take as long as 8 or 9 hours to get there. And they normally didn't leave the docks in Kissimmee until 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. So in the wintertime, by dark, it was time to dock somewhere and get off the river, because they didn't run the rivers at night because of the obstructions.
Yeah. Captain Clay Johnson. He was quite a colorful person. Everybody said that he looked like Mark Twain, and he liked to curse a lot, we know that. And he was the operator of several boats, including the Rosetta that's associated with Shell Hammock. And later on, he gave his son-in-law, George Steffi, the boat, the Rosetta, and George Steffi had married Johnson's daughter, Ada. So he gave him the boat, and I know he was associated with Shell Hammock. The Rosetta is named after the 2 daughters of Clay Johnson. And his wife's name was Mamie too, so he named another ship, another steamboat, the Mamie Lound, I think it is.
And you want to tell the story about the Rosetta sinking at the docks in Kissimmee? Oh
yeah, it was one of the last boats on the Kissimmee River. They say, history books say that it was sunk at the dock in Kissimmee during a hurricane in 1926, I believe it was. And that was the end. The Steamboat Era stopped about the late 1920s.
But there's a lot of reasons why the steamboats stopped that other than the Rosetta sinking at the docks. But it was a natural thing to phase them out. Number one, the internal combustion engine was invented, so the boats, the steamboats, most of them were converted over to internal combustion engines instead of being steam powered. And steam engines were so dangerous, and so many people were killed, so many engineers or boiler tenders were killed when the boilers exploded, that the government actually passed a law that said you had to be a licensed captain and a licensed engineer to operate a steamboat. So that did away with all the private steamboats, and there were people that owned steamboats that were private and didn't do it for commercial reasons.
The steamboats took a large staff, a number of people, to keep that boat going. You had a fireman, and you had an engineer, and you had the captain, and with the motorized boats, it didn't take that much. So it was quicker and faster, and steamboats just kind of disappeared.
But the main reason that the steamboats were phased out is because of the infrastructure of the state being built up. The railroads came in,
Paved roads.
Plant and Flagler and the other big railroad builders had reached Miami and Tampa, Arcadia, and there were roads being built too. So now that waterway wasn't anywhere nearly as important because they could transport things by rail and roadway.
Faster and more comfortable too.
Today it is our home.
Our private residence.
And it's basically, we haven't changed the outer structure to it any. It's still got the same porches and the same banisters. The inside, of course, we've modernized and put electricity in and
Toilets.
and built on bathrooms and a kitchen. Because back in the 1800s, the kitchen for the hotel or the house was set aside, which was common for that period. They separated the kitchen from the house so that when the kitchen caught on fire, it didn't burn down the house. Mm-hmm. Just the kitchen burned up. Mm-hmm. So.
It's a part of old Florida that's slowly disappearing. There, the landings like shell hammock and grape hammock and all those, they don't exist anymore.
It's not a public place at this time. Sometime in the future it may, when Sue and I are gone or in a nursing home. Our son Benjamin may decide to make it a public place, but right now it's not open to the public. We're trying to preserve it as closely as we can to the way it was when it was bought by my great-great-grandfather in 1901. And if you look at the front of the house right now, you couldn't tell any difference between what it's like now and what it was like in 1901 when George Bryan Tattman bought it. So we're proud to be the owners of it. We're proud as punch that Sue has done all of the research on it and been able to establish a lot of the facts that were, before she did all the research, was just rumors and innuendos, and a lot of the stories that we had and things that we thought were true about it, she was able to research and find out that in fact they weren't true. So in that we're proud. And like I say, sometime in the future, probably not in our generation, but maybe in our son's generation, it may be open to the public, or donated to the state, or given to the state, or sold to the state, or something.
Who knows? There's lots of options. But Shell Hammock, our house, is located on the Kissimmee River, and it is very isolated, and it's very private, And the only way really to see the house and all the out structures around it is by river. It's about 300 acres, so we're right on the river, and you have to go through lock gates and cows and cattle and to get there. So we like the privacy. It is very isolated, but you know, that's the way we live. We like it.
Scattered throughout the state are fish houses. These are locations where a person could find a place to stay, tools for fishing, and are able to gut and clean their catches. In the early 20th century, Mr. Leon G. Bruce purchased land along the Kissimmee River in order to construct a fish camp. Mr. Bruce had established the Coca-Cola bottling plant in Bartow in 1914 and utilized this fishing camp, named Camp Mack, as a private retreat for Coca-Cola employees.
I'm Albert Reese. I'm Leon Grady Bruce's grandson.
And I'm John Reese, and I am a grandson. We were from a family of 7 kids. Albert was the youngest, and I was right in the middle. About 1914, he and my grandmother had married. I think they married in January of that year, and then they decided to come to Florida. And he came to Bartow, and he met Mr. Hebb, who owned Hebb's Grocery in Bartow at that time. Mr. Hebb hired him to deliver groceries on a bicycle. I think it was $15 a month, my grandmother said he made. Then Mr. Hebb and Mr. Whitehead bought a Coca-Cola franchise. That was back in the early days of Coca-Cola bottling. And Mr. Hebb knew that my granddaddy and his brother had a little soda water shop in Georgia at one time where they bottle 1 bottle at a time, peach and strawberry, stuff like that. So he asked him if he would operate a bottling plant. And he told him he would, that he could do that, and he got his brother to come and help him. And that's how he got working in the Coca-Cola business. And then later on, Mr. Hebb and Mr. Whitehead had some sort of falling out over the business part, and they decided to get out of it. And my granddaddy wanted to buy the franchise, so he went to Chapman Root in Daytona Beach and borrowed the money from him. Mr. Root's family owned the Root Glass Company, which were the originators of the hobble skirt bottle for Coca-Cola. And so Mr. Root asked him if he would agree to buy all of his glass from Root Glass Company. And he told him he would, so then he loaned him the money to buy the franchise. And that's how he actually got the Coca-Cola bottling plant. And it was Bartow Bottling Works at first when Mr. Hebb owned it. And in 1927, the roads were pretty bad, and he felt like they needed to build a plant up in Winter Haven, which was a little more centralized, but it also would give him better coverage on some of the areas. And so he built a plant there. And at that time, he changed the name to Ridge Coca-Cola Bottling Company. My family sold it in 1969. They sold out lock, stock, and barrel. Mr. Root bought back. And actually, it was the original Chapman Root's grandson that bought the Ridge Coca-Cola Bottling Company back into his bottling operations.
And Chapman Root, just for side note, ended up being, wasn't he the largest Coca-Cola bottler in the Southeast?
Maybe in the largest independent Coca-Cola.
Yeah, independent from the Coca-Cola Corporation in the world. And I mean, he was throughout our life. They were in our, woven within our family. Our granddad was an avid sportsman, and he and his friend Mr. McIntyre, that lived in Bartow and owned a couple of different companies, used to come down here fishing. And they did it for apparently quite a while. And one day, as they came back up to where their vehicle was, there was a bunch of cowboys all around the vehicle. And when they got up, and the guy said, "What the hell are y'all doing here?" And he said, "We're fishing." "Why?" He said, I won't say what they said, according to Granddad, but it was blankety blank blank. And they really gave him the heretofore and told him to get out and don't ever show your face around here again. So my granddaddy and Mr. Mack got in my granddaddy's truck and drove to Bartow to Polk County Abstract. And he found out who owned the property. Within 2 or 3 days, my granddad owned about 3,000 acres out here. And that's how Camp Mack got started, but the name came from Mr. McIntyre. That was my granddad's buddy, and that's why they called it Camp Mack. And then as my granddad developed Camp Mack, it was only for his personal use and his friends and family. He built a house for him and my grandmother and family, whoever. And as that got to where it wouldn't hold the crowds, he'd go over here and he'd build another place. And then after that, all the other, he just kept building buildings. Well, as time passed, he had enough buildings that there were people that wanted to come out and fish and rent places. So he started renting places, not really trying to make a lot of money, but just to share his happiness. And pretty much that was the way Camp Mack came to be. Anything else? All the names, and one of them was the Liar's Den. That's where the store is today. I'm not sure it's the same building, but that's where the store was, and it was called the Liar's, or store is, it was called the Liar's Den.
As he had more and more people coming out, and he decided he needed some help, and he hired a young man. The only thing I knew is Slim. I don't guess I ever knew his last name. But Slim he wore a pair of cut-off jeans and no shirt. I never saw him with a shirt on when I was little, and they said he never did wear a shirt, never wore shoes. He'd go to his cabin at night, and he would put bags on his feet because they'd be so dirty. And the lady who took care of cleaning up and all fussed so much about him dirtying up his sheets till he put bags on them to keep from dirtying them up. But Slim, they said, had an education from Yale, and said he just was disillusioned with the world and came down here just to get away and just wound up staying. And my granddaddy hired him. He paid him something, but then he would get out there. There was a skinning bench right out by the store, and he would get out there where they skin fish and throw the heads and guts and all in. Alligators would come up there, and they'd come up to get the scraps that were thrown in. And he would jump in and jump on an alligator and wrestle him up out of the water. And of course, people then give him tips and all from coming out there and watching his little show. Another thing that Slim would do is he drank a lot, and said he would get drunk at night and there'd be cockroach run across the wall of his cabin down there, and he'd pick up his shotgun and shoot at the cockroach. And I remember when I was real little, I came here to Camp Mack, but it was later years after the Dentons owned it that Jackie and I'd be playing together or something, and we went into one of the cabins, and that was the one that Slim lived in, and there were still holes in the wall. And my granddaddy said, yeah, that's where Slim used to shoot the cockroaches off the wall. As they got older, my grandparents got older, I used to come out and stay, because he would ask me, can you come out and help us this weekend? So I'd come out, I'd spend most of the summer out here. And sometime I'd have friends come out from Bartow that would come out and visit. you know, while I was here, just come stay with me. Georgie would come,
Denny
yeah.
Clements's brother, Georgie, he used to come out. Denny and I used to come out.
And, but most of the time I was the one that stayed out here a lot, you know, just helping them.
Well, there were a lot of sports figures that came out. Now, this is kind of to come back, but without going too far back. At Camp Lester, which is where my granddad went next door and started it after he sold Leon Denton Camp Mack. And Bert Schotten, who was a renowned baseball manager, bought a lot from my granddad right next door to him, and he brought a lot of the stars down to Camp Lester to them. But they used to come down to Camp Mack, and my granddad would let them fish or do whatever they wanted to do and have a good time. And we have a picture, I don't know where it is, do you, the one of President Eisenhower?
I'm not sure, I'll look, see.
But we have a picture of him drinking a Coke here at Camp Mack, and I think he also came back to Camp Lester. Our granddad was quite a politician, and he was mayor of Bartow 3 times, I think you said?
Twice, yeah, 2 times. 16 years, I think it was, that he was city commissioner.
He helped start the golf course and all, you know, negotiated that deal and all kind of different things. But he as I said earlier, Spessard Holland was a 3rd or 4th cousin, whatever, to us. But to our grandmother, Mary, his wife, was my grandmother's 1st cousin. And so we called them Uncle Spessard and Aunt Mary. But they were here all the time because he was one of my granddad's best friends. Richard Frisbee, wasn't Mr. Frisbee's name Richard? Or was he?
Well, Loyal was all I remember.
Okay, Loyal, which is not the 2 that you know, but their daddy. And I'm not talking about Lowell, or the photographer. I'm talking about his daddy and his uncle, Richard. Their daddy came down here a lot. Mr. Badcock came down all the time. And my granddad was the cabinet member for the Southwest Florida for the state of Florida Freshwater Game and Freshwater Commission. Our granddad was a cabinet member when Spessard Holland was governor. So that brought quite a few people down. And it just was a plethora of politicians, a lot of them, that used to come down here and fish and hunt. Used to be quite a hunting place. Yo, I'm telling you, and duck, they used to do a lot of duck hunting and deer hunting. And I think they even shot a few bears and hogs, and turkey. But
Spessard Holland and Mr. Frisbee, and they were my granddad's 2 best friends, and they were down, and the 3 of them were going fishing. And they went out into Lake Kissimmee to Storm Island. And a storm came up out there and swamped the boat. I mean, it sank, all their tackle and everything in it. And so they said, well, the best thing to do is try to swim back to the mouth of the river. And get back there, we can get on some dry land. So they started swimming. They swam and swam. And my granddaddy said they got fairly close to the mouth of the river. They could see the land right there. And he said, well, I've had it. I'm worn out. He said, you guys keep going. I'm going to try, but he said, I probably won't make it. And said, so he kept going, and a little bit, his feet went down, and said he hit bottom. Stood up and said it was a little, almost chest deep. So they walked on up to the land and walked back to Camp Mack. 1,000 Legs was a Model A Ford. My granddaddy bought new, I think it was 1929. I know that they said my mother took it to college when she was up there, up in Georgia.
She went to Westland College in Macon, Georgia.
But Thousand Legs later on was used because all the roads in and out of here were dirt. And sometime there'd just be two ruts, and it was almost impossible in most cars to get in and out. The Thousand Legs was built way up, and it would go right through. Just staying in the ruts, you could drive all the way through. And so that was the Thousand Legs. That was what we used to do after I remember it. You know, they had other cars now, but the Thousand Legs was used to come back and forth to the camp because you never knew how the roads would be. It was used to launch boats, a lot of times, because it had a low gear and you could back in, let the boat off, and just pull it right out, no problem.
Where some of them couldn't even get their boats back here. They'd have to go out and pull their boat in and then drop it off for them.
Yeah, I used I was asked to back the boats in for a lot of people when they came down. I used to do that when I stayed out here. And there was Mr. Parker from Tampa who owned the Pepsi plant there in Tampa.
Oh, God. Drove a Rolls Royce, Silver Cloud.
Drove a Rolls Royce, and he had a hitch on that Rolls Royce, which I'd never seen. But he asked me to back that in, and I was scared to death.
You were in the Rolls Royce, weren't you?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I backed it down, and they
had mink
got
seats.
The boat out.
Never forget it.
And drove the car back up, but I was scared half to death. And something would happen, I'd slip or something and back that thing into the river.
He was a dude though. He and Papa were good friends.
Oh yeah.
He was a Pepsi-Cola bottler, and they became good friends. He was a mess though.
But he would come down, but he always had to bring his own soft drinks. My granddaddy told him, said, nope, there won't be anything but Coca-Cola down here. And he did. He would bring his drinks.
Oh. The Thousand Legs, all of the members of our family learned to drive in that, didn't they? Except
just about. You and Nancy, I think.
Nancy did.
Did she?
Yeah. I learned in the Chevrolet.
Yeah. But all of us kids, there were 7 of us, and just about all of us learned to drive on the Thousand Legs down here. Today, actually,
Harriet.
Yes, my sister passed away this past Easter, and she had bought it. Her son found it.
Over at
I think Andy Thornell owned it.
Yeah, Andy Thornell.
Yeah, he owned it. He had bought it sometime or other and was showing it to Scott, and he's telling him about being down at Camp Mack and Camp Lester, and Scott said, well, that's my granddaddy's old car, and he bought it. Or no, Harriet bought it. Yeah, my sister bought it from him. But
yeah, we were talking about it on the way down here, hoping that the stewardship of that vehicle will be good, because that sister's dead now. She would have made sure it was taken care of.
It will be.
Yeah, it will be. My grandfather had 2 sons and our mother, and one of the sons, the youngest, Lester, he was a man's man, but he was a Air Force fighter pilot. He had an airplane since he was about 12 or 13 years old, didn't he?
I don't know. He had a license when he was 16. I do know that for flying.
He had his own plane flying around terrorizing Bartow when he was that old. But Lester got shot down and killed during World War II. And Robert, I think it was Robert Losh, was his wingman. They were both pilots from Bartow. And the deal was, when somebody went down, then if you were their wingman, you'd fly around till you'd see them give you the wave that they're okay. So Mr. Losh saw Lester get into his raft and wave like, I'm okay. But he was surrounded by Japanese ships. And I don't mean, but they weren't right on him, but they were all over within striking distance. So he probably just got killed, finished off. our grandmother swore he'd walk in the door till the day she died at almost 104. Anyway, the Camp Lester became, our granddaddy was so grieved over the loss of Lester that he just, I guess he couldn't really take the memories here, could he? Or just real.
I don't know. He decided he was ready to get out of the fishing camp business anyway, and he built one house over there and sold this to the Dentons. And then over there, he started doing the same thing. He built a Happy Landing and the Coop Pen. That was 2 apartments over the boathouse, one boathouse. And he built the Gator Nest, which was a big house over a boathouse, and he built that for our family and our uncle's family, you know, the close family that wanted to come down and stay. And then next thing you know, he built another one, the Paddler Shack, the High and Dry. And so it wasn't long before he had a fish camp going over there too. He hadn't really planned to.
And we spent a lot of time there, and that's how we jumped the fence. I mean, that was jumping the fence.
Yeah, I stayed down there with him quite a bit when I was a teenager, because my granddaddy was getting old enough, and on like holiday weekends, there'd be a big crowd come in, and I'd come out, stay with them, sell bait, and clean out the boats, and haul sell gas, stuff like that, you know, to help them out.
Right. I was relatively young whenever my granddad sold it. Maybe not even born if it was 47, but we're thinking it was 53. But anyway, I don't have so many memories about it because I was young. So John will have more memories. Now I have across the fence memories. Our grandmother forbid us to come over here, didn't she?
Well, I used to come over and play with Jackie all the time.
I know, and I used to sneak over and play and go to the store and buy something. And then a couple of people that worked for my granddad and my dad, Bob Mates being one, had places here. And so we'd come over and go to their house or whatever. And there used to be, now my granddad and his friends, they could drink and party, okay? I mean, those guys we've mentioned, but they were a little more controlled or something than it used to be pretty wild over here. So in my grandmother's eyes. Now you have to understand, was a strong Methodist woman. And so most of my memories are across the fence, you know, jumping the fence and running around and going back before she caught me over here. But you may have some.
No, we had, I mean, Jackie and I used to play together out here, and we fished together. We used to set up set hooks all up and down the river out here on the cypress trees, and this was back before they dug everything out. I mean, it was an old meandering river. And we could go out any day of the week and just catch all the fish you want right there under the cypress trees. But we would set hooks and bait them at night, put them down, next morning come out and catch catfish and turtles. You know, and that was one of the things when I was growing up I just loved to do. I spent a lot of time out here. One of my favorites was up at Reedy Creek, up on the north end of Lake Hatchethaw. And there was a young lady, and I was about 14 years old, but she was from Tampa, single, and she would come out and every year stay, I think, 4 or 5 days out here and go fishing. And she'd catch fish. But she came in one time and she told my granddaddy, she said, you know, I would really like to catch a big bass. Can you tell me where to go to catch a big bass? And so he asked me, he had to go out of town, and he said, would you mind taking her up maybe someplace like Reedy Creek, see if she can get a good sized bass? So, of course, I was glad to do it. And jumped in the boat and went up to Reedy Creek, and it was one of these places that was usually clogged up with hyacinths, and you really had to work to get through and then get back into some open water to fish. And she cast about 3 times, and she caught a 12 3/4 pound bass. Of course, she was just thrilled, and she went back to Tampa, and she was on one of the television programs with her, showing her bass that she had caught out here. She was so proud of it.
It was a wonderful time for us to be growing up. And we were fortunate enough to have the best of the best to play with. And I remember having the freedom to go, well, when I first started driving a boat by myself, I could go to Hatchney Hall and Kissimmee. I had to stay in the river between Hatchney Hall and Kissimmee. I wasn't dare allowed to go on Kissimmee because it's a pretty rough lake. It can be. But what I used to do is sneak off up through Lake Hatchney Hall and go through Cypress Canal, go to Cypress Lake, and then what was
Toho.
Yeah, Toho, which Kissimmee is on Toho, and we used to. It was just a blast. Now, one thing we hadn't talked about is after the Dentons bought Camp Mack, Southwest Florida Water Management, or Corps of Engineers, I believe it was, decided that Kissimmee River needed to be straightened out because I remember days we'd go out and you could walk to Lake Hatchney Hall almost in the river.
You'd have to pull the boat across the sandbar to get into the lakes in low water times, and it was up and down during the year.
But then when they dug the ditch, that's what we called it, was the ditch, then it totally changed things. And I remember they used to tell us to stay out of the wood, or tell me to stay out of the woods up and down the river because the bootleggers, moonshiners, had stills. In fact, we used to find stills all the time, moonshine stills. So that was a lot. Yeah, it was just an exciting life and a fun life. I remember the story you had of, I don't know who you were fishing with. May have been me and you, but we were in Dead River fishing, and you had a stringer of bass tied to your side, and he kept feeling something tugging at it more than just the fish, and I think you got it up, and it was a cottonmouth, wasn't it, hanging off the end of one of the bass. And that was just.
I let him have the whole stringer. Yeah.
All I can say, it was the best life you could ever think of.
I often thought my son loved to hunt, he loved to fish. And by the time he came along, there's hardly any place you could just go fishing or hunting or anything in Florida, I thought many times I wished that he could have been able to have the life that I did down here, because we'd go fishing. We'd get a boat around Winter Haven and down Frost Proof, used to fish a lot down that way. But it wasn't anything like living out here and just being able to run around the woods, just thousands of acres, nothing but woods, just running, playing, and having a good time.
The Bruce family eventually came to sell Camp Mack to Leon Denton in the 1940s and later established another fish camp nearby on the Kissimmee River. Camp Mack was maintained as a fish camp through the 1980s, and many of the historic buildings are still intact on site. Today, the area is still operated as a campground for much the same purposes as first intended, and guests flock to the area for the legendary bass fishing. The Denton family still maintains an airboat business based at Camp Mack.
Jack Denton, second son, Gladys and Leon, and my brother Ronnie. We were 4 and 7 when we moved here in 1947.
We came down here originally. They pulled up there in front of the store, and I got out and walked in there. It was knee-deep in water in that store.
Daddy got out of the service, and he and my granddad bought Camp Mack from about 4 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. He run Camp Mack by himself. That's what he did. He was on the USS New York. They fought in the Philippines, and he was down there, and they battled the Japanese kamikaze pilots. He was a gunner on the USS New York. They bought the place, and from the original Camp Mack was built in the 20s, 27, 28, and it was a private retreat for the Coca-Cola owners of a bottling operation in Tampa. And the guy's name was L.G. Bruce, and his partner was McNamara, James McNamara, and that's where the Camp Mack came from.
McIntyre.
Excuse me.
McIntyre.
McIntyre was the guy's name that was a partner in the Coca-Cola bottling business with Mr. Bruce. Okay. They were owners together. They owned the Tampa bottling plant, Winter Haven, and Bartow, all three of them. And they built, that's like I say, they built the Camp Mack for a retreat. They come down to the Camp Mack and stayed in the cabins. They built cabins, and when we bought Camp Mack, Dad turned it into a fish camp, and those cabins were his livelihood. Stayed rented all the time. Later on, I knew the original Mr. Bruce. His son took it over, and that's who they actually bought it from, Leon Bruce. And when he sold the camp to Dad, they moved next door and bought what is now Camp Lester. Bought that property.
That fired him up. He went down there and went over the fence after Mr. Bruce, trying to get him. Made him mad.
Interesting.
They didn't have, back then they didn't have any kind of clause or anything, no compete clause or anything. But he really didn't build it for a fish camp originally. He just built it to have a place for his family, and then they added on, kept adding on, and then when he sold the property, it was a fish camp too, okay. Camp Lester. Dad built it as a swimming hole, and it had a
flowing well.
Had a artesian flowing well that flowed 110 gallons a minute, and we had a culvert running under the road into the river, and it stayed the same level all the time. The water run in the river. It wasn't but 126 feet deep, so you didn't have to go very far to get the water. It's such a thing. But when the camp sold, when Dad sold the camp in '83, he sold to the family, the Snively family, Pate Snively, and his family. Pate filled it in. He just didn't think they needed it, so it was kind of sad. And we were living in a new house at the time, our mother's house. She was living in it, but we had a lot of great memories in that swimming hole. And we had fish in it. There was fish in the pond, you could see them, but it was pretty neat. We started out with, there wasn't a school bus, except up at where Alcomas used to have their headquarters. It was 8 miles to where the school bus came. And there was a family lived up here in the woods. The county paid them. They picked Ronnie and I up with their 2 children. And we had one other guy on the way we picked up by a little round lake and carried us to the bus. And then my mother would pick us up in the afternoon before we started playing sports at that school, When we started driving, he started driving early, about 14. Dad went to the policeman, the head chief in Lake Wales, and said, hey, these boys have got to practice ball, and we can't come get them, and we can't run in there every hour or so. So he said, well, if they'll just drive to the school and go straight to the ball field and then straight home, I'm good with that, as long as they don't come uptown. First day we got to go to town with that Jeep, we went up and got us a banana split at the drugstore. So we didn't go by that law very long, but that's how we got back and forth. Growing up, we had a 2-lane dirt road in here. It was hard to get back in here. You really wanted to go fishing if you got back here, And he and I had a Jeep, and we would run up and down the road on the weekend. People would get stuck. We'd pull them out, and they'd pay us. We didn't charge them, but they'd tip us, give us a couple of dollars, and, you know, we had a little extra spending money by pulling people out. Some people get stuck 2 or 3 times before they got here. I mean, the road was that bad, you know. It was just, we had an old gas pump. I have a picture of it also. It was one of them old pumps that you pump the gas up and top in a glass container, and it measured the gallons. You pumped it up into that, and then you took the hose and mashed the lever on the hose, and you could watch it come down out of the glass and get as many gallons as you wanted, up to 5. It would hold 5 gallons. Bailed out boats, you know, everybody was working. We worked our whole, from the time we were little guys right on up, you know. I mean, there was always something to do. Rake leaves, you know, pull moss. There's plenty of stuff to do. After we got older, he and I both played 4 sports at the high school, so we would leave it before daylight in the morning and get home after dark. And still, the weekends were there that we had to work. He and I used to come home from school. Now, this was before they dug the river out, and the river meandered down like this. Anytime it rained, we'd just get in the boat and go fishing. And you could catch fish, water running in off the banks into the river. There'd always be fish there catching bait. So, you know, places like that we knew about. And it was really some place to grow up. I mean, there wasn't any place like it. We used to have secret fishing holes that we could go to and nobody else would go to because we lived here and we'd find them. But in this day and time with GPSs and bottom machines and all, you don't have any secret fishing holes anymore. There wasn't a lot of people. You know, it was us during the week. There's 4 of us, and during the week, we never saw anybody, except people that may be in the cabin for more than a weekend. But on the weekends, it would fill up. You know, all the cabins would be full. When Dad bought the place in '47, all the cabins, they had names on them. They had their name on them, and I'll read you the names of them. I just was remembering them. The River Rat, Sleepy Hollow, Never Sleep, the Jitterbug, the City Slicker, Pelican Roost, Seldom Inn, and Stumble Inn. Those were names of some of the cabins. And they were filled up on the weekends and during the summer. When school was out, they stayed full. When Dad sold the place in '83, the new owner was Pete Snively. He bought it. And he had visions of building new stuff around out here in the back where it is now. And so he came to me one day and he said he was going to tear all those cabins down. And I said, Pete, I don't know, I think that's a mistake. I said, those cabins are, you know, they're grandfathered in. And you don't have to get any permits if you want to fix them up or you want to do it. And they were made out of that old hard pine. They went through every hurricane, come through here, never heard of one of them. It might have ripped a piece of tin off the roof or something, but the cabin itself, you couldn't hurt them. So I said, I don't know if I'd tear them cabins down. Well, he didn't listen like normally, and he went ahead and tore them down. Well, about 5 years later, he came to me and said, man, I wish I'd have listened to you. He didn't have anything to rent, and that's where that is. All his revenue was in them cabins, cabins and boat ramp and that little store. That was it. But the cabins were a big deal, and so he tore them down, and he was sorry later. But the camp was a wonderful place to grow up. We had a lot of friends. My dad had 2 friends in Tampa. One of them was Channel 13. Salty Saul Flashman was his name. He had a sports show, mainly fishing. And Tom McEwen, who was a sports writer of the Tampa Tribune, he was voted the Sports Writer of the Year in the Southeast 15 years in a row or something. Him and my dad were like this. Dad got more free advertising than you couldn't pay for what he got for free because they were friends, and he let them come down, stay in the cabin, bring their family, take them fishing. And when he wanted something, they'd call him, he'd come over and be on TV or be in the newspaper. Tom wrote an article about him every month or so. Excuse me. And he'd carry fish over to the television station and show them live. And so he got a lot of free advertisement. The weekends, people from Tampa would just flood this place because of all the advertising, that they gave him and the fishing was good, Channel 13 used to come here a lot. Salty Saul Flashman had a TV show, and he was big on Camp Mack. He had a lot of stuff there about Camp Mack. Well, his TV show, Leon, he told Leon one time, Daddy told him he had a soft-shell turtle he'd caught. And he said, well, can you bring him over here? We'll put him on TV. And Leon said, yeah. So he got him and put him in a wash tub, carried the turtle over there and put him on TV. Well, people went to calling in. They was mad because they had him out of the water. They had these do-gooders, these tree huggers, and wanted to call him about, what are y'all going to do? Are you going to take that turtle back to the river and put, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We're going straight back to Camp Mack and put him in the river. As soon as that program was over, they went over there to Joe Murphy's bar, which was on Dale Mabry, cut him up and fried him out there in the back. But everybody had fried turtle for dinner. Turtle didn't make it back to the river, no. We had a lot of famous people come to Camp Mack. Jack Dempsey was one, and Jack Dempsey was one of the greatest boxers ever lived. And Billy Graham was here, spent the night with us, ate catfish and grits for breakfast. And Jack Dempsey, I have a story about Jack Dempsey. Cowboy Luttrell was a boxing and wrestling promoter in Tampa for years. And he brought Jack Dempsey here to Camp Mack. They were close friends. Billy Graham came down here with a reverend that Cowboy Luttrell knew from Tampa. He spent the night with us. Four-star General Mark Clark, he was here. General Clark was the youngest four-star general in the history of World War II. All the football coaches from the University of Florida, since Bob Woodruff, Ray Graves, Charlie Pell, all those people were friends with Dad through Tom McEwen, the sports writer. And they all came here and fished and hung out, and we were all Gator fans because of that, have been since we were little boys. This picture was in 1952. We had a boatcade that left the town of Kissimmee, over 100 boats every year, and they would go from the town of Kissimmee to Lake Okeechobee, and they spent the first night at Camp Mack, and my dad would cook fish for all of them. We'd save up catfish and fry them for them, and then they'd go down and spend the night. I think the second night was down around Kisso, and then the third, they spent 3 nights, and then they'd be in Okeechobee. And then they'd turn around and come back by themselves or however. Nobody came back together, but they all went together on the way down. And it was a great thing. We'd meet them here and go down with them the rest of the way. So we really enjoyed that. And but the motorcade, and it went on for years, for 25, 30 years. They finally discontinued it, but that was a great thing to see and be a part of. This is a story that has gotten out of whack over the years. If you look at this picture, this is a picture of a milk truck that used to be refrigerated. People hauled bottles of milk around door to door to your house, okay? Well, there were 3 commercial fishermen that lived out here on the river. One right across the camp over here, one up on Hastings Hall on that first point, and then one over there where the bus was brought. They brought this bus in from St. Cloud across Gardner Marsh on that road that's over there, down to where, on Kissimmee Lake, where it sit to keep their catfish in. They'd fish all during the week, and then Saturday, they'd take their fish by boat, go up Osceola Slough and go up to the road that come across and meet the catfish man. He'd buy their catfish, pay them for them on the spot, and then he'd bring 100-pound blocks of ice with him in his truck, and they'd bring it back to the milk truck. We call it a milk truck. But over the years, it's gotten changed, the name's gotten changed for some reason to a school bus. Some of these Yankees that have been down here and people that I don't know, they ask you, where'd you catch the fish? Over there in front of that school bus. Well, does that look like a school bus to you? No, never has been a school bus. But it got all, that's where, and you ask some of these people down here around the fire now, oh yeah, we caught them over at the school bus. And I tell them, there ain't no damn school bus. There ain't never been one over there. So anyway, that's the milk bus right there. Well, one of the catfishermen's name was Son Arnold. He was a full-blooded Seminole Indian. When he would get the catfish in, I was a little guy. I was probably 7 years old, 8 years old. I had my own little 5-horse Johnson, and I'd jump in it and I'd go up there to his camp where he would, and just sit there and watch him clean fish. And he'd throw me some, and then I'd bring them back home and cook them. But he was a great guy and lived there for a long time and made his living selling catfish. And there were 2 other ones that did the same thing. They all carried them over there and stored them in there till Saturday and hauled them to town. Well, we had 2 catfishermen move in across the river after these guys were gone, named Harwell Tyson and Henry Clark. And Daddy was sitting in front of the store one day, and Henry Clark drove up in the boat and said, Leon, I need for you to go across the river with me. I've killed old Harwell. He said, what? He said, yep, I shot him out in the chest. He said, what for? He said, well, I told him not to mess with my dog. He stole my dog, and I was looking for him last night and I couldn't find him. I come home this morning and Harwell had him, and a gator or something had bit his right front foot off. So he walked up there with a double-barrel shotgun, stuck it to his chest and pulled the trigger. So Daddy went across the river. Sure enough, they're deader than a hammer over the dog. And so that was the way it was on the river back then. River. Yeah. But old Henry went to jail. They put him in Kissimmee, and I went to see him. Ronnie and I went to see him 3 or 4 times over the years. He stayed in there about 15 years, and they let him out. But he's an old catfisher. I can tell you the story. My dad was sitting in front of the store one day, and he looked out there, and the river was muddy. And he said, well, something happened up there, I don't know. And next day he looked, it was a little more muddier, and so he got in his boat and drove up there, and they were drag lines digging the ditch coming down Cypress Canal. He knew nothing about it until that day. It never was publicized. They got it slipped through the legislature and started digging the ditch. And it was done. Wasn't anything you could do about it. But it's a terrible, terrible thing that happened.
It nearly flipped me out when they decided to dig this ditch. And I was very upset about it, but nothing you could do. They were going to dig it out. The water used to flow by the Camp Mack, moving. Now it don't flow by the camp. Just that big ditch over there.
The river, it was the biggest ecological foul up that's ever been in this area, ever. We used to have the most beautiful water, clear and flowing all the time, and it took care of itself. The water would get high. When we have a hurricane or we get a lot of rain, the water would get high, like he said, it would get up in the store. We've paddled a boat from our house to the store down the road, and in 3 days it'd drain off, be gone. And in the summertime it would get dry. I drove that Jeep we talked about earlier from the mouth of the river across the lake to Storm Island and the Pig Trail. That's how low it would get. But it would fill back up. We didn't have a problem with it. Dad would take these boats down to the mouth of the lake and park them, and we'd run people back and forth down there in an airboat so they could go fishing. But when they dug the river out, when they made a straight ditch out of it, what happened was all these nutrients coming from north of us, out of Disney, out of Kissimmee, out of Shingle Creek, out of Reedy Creek, Dead River, all that stuff. The old river used to filter the water with the grasses and the islands and that kind of stuff. all that was gone and the water just flowing straight through, and it started building up. We'd have never had an evasive plant that we got now had it stayed the way it was, because we never had any before. It'd been there since the beginning of time, and everything in that river and lake was all natural. Wasn't anything like hydrilla or, stuff that was caused by digging that river out. All the habitat changed. Today it's ruined. It's just, they go out there and they still fish, and the fishing's good, but wildlife habitat is nothing like it was. Our big thing was what we don't have today are ducks. We were big duck hunters, all of us, and we don't have any ducks anymore. It's just they spray so much, and what they spray dies, goes to the bottom, makes mud tussets, float back up, make floating islands, spray more of it sinks, and the lake is so toxic, ducks ain't gonna stay here. We don't have any place for them, there's no food for them. My mama had passed away, and Dad was getting old, and he wanted out of it, and it was a good deal for him. It was a lot of money, so he sold it to the Snively family, and they sold it to another outfit, and then the current owners bought it from them. I use the house during hunting season. Ronnie has it through the winter, and his family, he's got children that like it, and I got children and grandchildren that like it, and of course Andy runs the airboat tour here, and he uses it, and his family uses it, so we're going to keep it. We're going to keep it for them. And today, 4 generations of Denton family enjoy the use of Camp Mack in the house.
It was just a great place to live, grow up.
There's all kinds of stories. We could sit here for a day and tell you all the stories about Camp Mack, but overall, growing up at Camp Mack, there was no experience like it. All of our friends that lived in town wanted to come home with us and be at Camp Mack. That was just part of the deal. We all just loved being at Camp Mack. Everybody did, it was the place to be. Girlfriends, some of us had girlfriends that liked to be out here, and the early years were, it was hard to get in and out of here. And as we got on up into the deal, Daddy got the road worked on, got it paved, and made it a little easier. But a lot of great memories we have here, and it's something you'll always remember. You can't lose those memories.
From the Florida Highwayman to Martin Johnson Head, many painters have been called to explore Florida's unique natural environment. Thomas Freeman is one such artist. Renowned as an art instructor and artist, much of his work focuses on Florida landscapes. Freeman is also a storyteller. Through his art and through the stories he tells, he shares his passion and his experiences as a Floridian. A great egret nicknamed Ichabod is a common subject of Freeman's work, and he happily recounts his encounters with this unexpected muse.
I'm actually now 94 years old. I've spent most of that time in my life here in Florida. I've spent 75 years in Polk County. Painting has been my love of life, and I don't have any reason to know why I began painting, but I did. And I have approached now 1,000 paintings. And I don't know just exactly what number, but it's very close to 1,000 paintings over a period of the 94 years. When we got ready to move into the Florida area, I wanted to be on the water near the water. Camp Mack was just beautiful. There was a house that a man had moved out of and moved out to Texas. And he was ill at the time, and soon the house became available, and it was just a straight built house with a flat roof on it. And I bought it, rebuilt it, made a home there for my family, and we lived there for about 15 years, and there was a home built at another place, and we bought it. So Camp Mack has been our place. It's just been our place in the sun in Florida, and it's just been a fabulous journey for me and my family. I still have one. My sister Roberta is still living, and she's 88 years old. And I don't know. It's just there's no place like it. Jackie Denton and I were good friends, and we still are. And we would go out in the evening, and he would sit on one side of the canal, and I would sit on the other side, and we would fish in the middle. We'd catch a fish, and I'd say, "That's mine, that's mine." No, he said, "That's on my hook." We'd bring it in. We had so much fun. It was a very fun organization of people who lived there, and they weren't people who were greedy about this or that or the. They were so friendly. And we just all had a great time. If you went to Camp Mack and you took a little boat and went across the Camp Mack, this is the scene that you would get. And it's one of the little cabins where the fishermen stayed when they went fishing, and they came back and dressed their fish here and then carried that fish to Haines City, and from Haines City to Orlando to sell it. And that was catfish. Oh, there's so many stories about this place. It's just absolutely, it's my heart. Ichabod is a great white egret, and he's about almost 5 feet tall. And Ichabod was the owner of a harem. He owned a harem of about 20 white egrets that lived at Camp Mack. Now, he didn't tolerate any other white egrets coming from around the lake anywhere to interfere with his visitations with his gang of white herons. They were all his. And he would fight over them. There was a man who came to Camp Mack who had cancer. And he lived in one of the little cottages there. And he became absolutely a friend, and he just took care of Ichabod. They went out together in the boat, and they came back in the boat. Now, when the man died, Ichabod had become my friend and had gone with me in my boat. And so what happened when the man died, Ichabod he transferred all of his friendship to me. And we would go and in the boat and sit in the water and find little minnows and fish to feed him, and he would love it. He'd just sit there, and I could toss him a little fish and a minnow in the boat, and he'd jump off and get it. I was visiting there. We'd moved from there, and this friend of mine said, "Is Ichabod still here?" I said, "Sure, he's here." I said, "Would you like to see him? Yes, I'd like to see Ichabod." I went to the end of the dock. "Ichabod, come here." He flew in, landed on the dock, and I had a little bucket of minnows that we'd been fishing, and I tossed him a couple of minnows, and he ran and picked up the minnows, waved to me, and flew away. That's the last I ever saw him. With a toss of his beak in a wink of his yellow eye, he gawked and squawked and ruffled his plume as the rover flew by. He faked and flapped as he shot the gap between two limbs of the cypress tree. And when he crooked his neck and fanned his tail, he was a sight to see. Now this rover knew as onward he flew amid such noisy expressions that a fight would take place, and just to save face he would deal with Icky's aggressions. Wings would flap and feathers would fly as they went darting across the sky. When the rover turned, he must have learned that old Icky was drawing nigh. Great furor they made when they entered the shade of stately shorelined oaks. Limbs were breaking and leaves were quaking as the air was filled with honks and croaks. The enemy was aghast as he hurried past the point of no return, and the search for a bride would be denied, and a lesson in life he would soon learn. The silence was rent with sounds they did vent as their course was set. The thought of retreat and the wings they did beat denied any thought of regret. Such thrashing and bashing along the banks of the river would get the attention of critters too numerous to mention and set their hearts all aquiver. They jabbed and swirled as they turned and twirled. To his enemy, old Icky was a sight. Icky thrust and parried, and his beak did flash as he got ready for a mighty fight. This river was his home, and he alone would defend his possessions. For the plume that he wore and the height he did soar belied his aggressions. Now make no mistake, as he flew in the wake of the enemy he pursued, his purpose was clear and he drew near. His mission could not be misconstrued. The intruder would find no peace of mind as he avoided a long and fearsome dive. So faint was the space between wing and face that he wondered if he was still alive. You see, this rover knew by the course that he flew, his path would be fraught with danger. So tempting fate in his search for a mate, he would find instead a source of real anger. No quarter would be given, no rules would be set. Just simply to the victor would go the prize, but you know at a glance the rover had chanced to meet Icky with death in his eyes. The first contact was a terrible whack upon the back of the river ranger. Then lifting his wings with a mighty beat, old Icky dived straight at this stranger. Ichabod knew as a bead he drew on the head of this fiend from the marsh and the slough, that the stranger would find the end of the line, and this he knew to be true. The game being played was more like a raid of old Icky's private harem. But mistakes can be made, and the rover well knew this one was enough to scare him. Gashing and slashing, they tumbled and rolled off the banks of the vast Kissimmee, a performance so great the defense of his mate must surely deserve an Emmy. The rover knew without any doubt, as he flapped and fluttered about, that Ichabod's wings and feet and awesome beak was straight and strong and stout. Now Ichabod was known both far and wide for how he fiercely fought for his bride. So streaking and shrieking, he grabbed a leg and gave this rover a ride. The rover was beaten, his tail feathers half eaten by the hero of the pond. So as the rover flew from the lovely slough, old Icky of his bride was truly fond. Now all was quiet, and the rover a sight, so sad to see was he. And the gawk he heard was a warning word from the top of a cypress tree. Ichabod was filled with pride for this beautiful bride so stirring. Her feathers so fine, her shape was a nine, and his heart was a whirring. Her beak he did tweak, and made his knees weak as he sat beside his lover, as they talked and planned of nests so grand and the love they had for each other. And now, perched amid her showy place of leaf and moss and limb, was a bride so white and with feathers so light, you could see she was fit and trim. A prize for his estate was surely this mate, so brave was old Ichabod, he knew no fear as his bride sat near and watched his battle with a wink and a nod. She preemed and gleamed in the sunlight so cheery and bright, for she knew this day that in no way would the rover win this fight. Now Ichabod was staid and most unafraid. With a toss of his flashing head, he would slash and smash till his enemy was gashed and most nearly dead. Her heart was glad, no time to feel sad. Her plume was dressed with delight. Old Icky, her mate, must surely rate the greatest respect for his furious might. Today, I saw him and he saw me. Together, we fancy each other. From me he'll take a fish so tasty and fine, and I his heart will discover.